Thank you. And last but not least, I'll ask Khushi Singh Rathore. She's a researcher, a scholar. She's an excavator of, I should say, diplomatic history of India. And she's focused very much on the silenced voices. She's focused on the invisibilized histories of women in the diplomatic space, and she has fascinating stories to tell, stories of both discrimination and of valor, stories of where women have broken the glass ceiling, and stories of how they have impacted and changed the discourse at critical times in our history post-freedom, and what lies ahead for us, for all of you as potential women in the security and foreign policy space, and men, about how these collaborations can be built for the future, for a better planet for all of us. So over to Khushi. She has many publications. Her most recent one is Excavating Hidden Histories, Indian Women in the Early United Nations. It's in the new history of women's international human rights. So you can see where her work is coming from. It's pioneering work. Not very many young scholars have ventured there so far. So over to you, Khushi. Would be very interested to know how these stories need to be brought up to the surface, because as Tabish Khair has said, that the problem with the post-truth society is not that we don't speak the truth, but that we have forgotten to listen to our stories. Yeah, thank you.
Am I audible?
You can take this.
Thank you, Professor Gopinath, and I'm really honored to be on this esteemed panel, and also petrified. So if I'm incoherent in between, please pardon me. My work, just to give context, began when I began my PhD, and I was just annoyed at reading the history of Indian diplomacy as a place where only men took decisions and only men were the leaders who brought us to where we are. And that's when I started digging. And it wasn't very difficult. I always say, it's not that I had to go and like really, really scrape to find who was the first woman diplomat of India. She was just written out of the history. And that is Vijayalakshmi Pandit. And in my first and the second year, I was often asked, why her? What's the need? Why do you have to study her? Or I was told, why don't you just like club all the women together and do like one consolidated study? And I had to push back and say, no, each one of them deserves a separate thesis and a separate book. And that is how the place of women in Indian diplomacy, the place of women in the Indian foreign policy narratives gets problematized. And it's this invisibilization of women which is what my work is trying to fill. When I look at women in the early diplomatic space, you can categorize them in three categories. So you have the political appointees, where you have women like Vijayalakshmi Pandit, you have Hansa Mehta, you have Sharifa Hamid Ali, Lakshmi Menon, very active on the international stage. Their contributions, when you look at individual histories of human rights, you do find their accounts. But when you look at the history of diplomacy and foreign policy, they are erased. And that speaks a lot about how foreign policy is conceptualized, how the foreign service is conceptualized. And as I was looking at them, you have Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who had an unprecedented career, ambassador to the USSR, US, UK, first woman president of the UN General Assembly, often reduced as Nehru's sister. And that's the pushback I got. She was just Nehru's sister. Did she actually do anything? Or it was an epitistic appointment. These are usually what I'm told. When I was looking at these women, and Hansa Mehta, as Professor Gopinath said, her contribution to UN Declaration of Human Rights, Sharifa Hamid Ali, who was a founding member of the UN Commission on the Status of Women in 1947. And ironically, she was also the most difficult person for me to find in the archives to write the history also. And that brings to surface the question that when we talk about women in diplomacy, we also have to be intersectional about it and ask, which women are we talking about? What is the sociological make of the women in Indian diplomacy. And what Ambassador Rao said, Indian Foreign Service is not the only one which didn't open to women easily. Very grudgingly, in the 1920s, 30s, diplomacies across the world, foreign offices across the world start opening to women. But the marriage ban, that rule, that stays globally. And I'm often surprised and also angered when I'm talking to fellow scholars and they say, but it was exactly this. So you also get the sense that misogyny and patriarchy, the universal character of how they operate in institutions. The question that you asked, like when I was looking at it, of the ideation, the role these women played in the early years of Indian foreign policy, and how, in my work, how I define it is in the ideation and the implementation and then representation. So we've spoken enough about the representational bit, and there are studies done about it. Women who've broken glass ceilings lay out the path for those who come after. It is the ideation and the implementation which remains to be an understudied field still in Indian foreign policy specifically. And when I'm looking at these women, and these are all political appointees that I've spoken of until now, they are talking to that global South, the South-South diplomacy, the ideas of non-alignment, women's movement. They're also part of women's movement. They're also leaders of women's movement who are speaking with the civil society back home, but at the same time, the international civil society. And that takes me to public diplomacy. Because the more I dig, the more I find blueprints of what today is public diplomacy, but women were already engaging in that at that point of time, be it public lectures, and they went on extensive public lectures. I'll very quickly, I figured my time is very less, so I'll very quickly go to the struggles that they faced. And the struggles are by design, because the rules were designed to keep large number of women out of the Indian Foreign Office, and the marriage ban we've already spoken about. But at the same time, the sociological make of the service. And again, that has a global character, because up till 2017, if you see most foreign offices in the world, women who have made it to the top posts are mostly single and childless. And that is sort of this global norm across foreign offices, which still needs to be pushed back against. And just like to wrap it up, I think my work is to use history and lay proof that women always belong to this space, and there should be more and more women in this terrain, because as a young Indian woman, I find it infuriating that it is 2023 and we still haven't met the 50% mark. And I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Khushi. Thank you very much indeed. I think she raised a very important issue of the invisibilization of women, but we all are aware that very few of us know about the 15 women who were members of our Constituent Assembly. We hear about the Ambedkars, the Nehrus, the Patels, the Maulana Azads, but we never hear about the 15 women. And they were diverse. They came from across the religious spectrum and also the class spectrum. In the context of the Foreign Service, they usually belonged to what were the more privileged classes, but in the Constituent Assembly, that was not always the case. So I think invisibilization, or again making women visible, making them count, making their voices count, recovering agency, moving out of victimhood, I think these are some of the issues that we take away.